Says it's live.
Are you ready, Bill? I'm sorry, I should have asked you.
Yes, I'm ready, Mark. Thanks.
And it's not letting me go live. Yay. Yeah, it's doing the same thing it did last time with YouTube. It's not allowing me to go live with YouTube. So I am recording it. When it's done recording, I will upload it to YouTube this evening. So.
Okay. Do we have anyone that's joined us other than panelists, or is that, or are we not doing that?
Yeah, we currently have 5 attendees. They're in view and listen only mode.
Okay.
Mark, before we start, can I do a quick sound check with Dave? Dave, can you just
What do we need to do?
say hello if you're on? All right, I see him on, but we might have to work out the audio issue. Okay. All right, I can do that while we're getting started.
Okay, very good. So I'm going to call the February 11th, 2021 meeting of the the Council Rock School Board Directors Finance Committee meeting to order. And I'm going to first ask that everyone on this Zoom call just go around and introduce themselves. So I am Mark Bialik, School Board Director. And I guess we'll start with, Mr. Tate, you start and we'll go around.
Thanks, Mark. Ed Tate, School Board.
Mike Thorwart, School Board.
Andy Block, School Board.
Joe Hidalgo, School Board.
Marianne McKee, School Board.
Ed Salomon, School Board.
Robert Frazier, Superintendent.
Phil Stone, Business Manager.
Matt Frederickson, IT Director.
Okay, is that everyone? Okay, so I'm going to ask Bill to take this. Just want to remind everybody to please mute your line or your input. So at the bottom of the box, the Zoom box, you mute your line. And then if you have a comment, just raise your hand and either Bill or I will recognize you. Thank you.
All right, good evening, everyone. We have several items tonight. One consent agenda item, which we will ask to be moved to the February 25th board meeting, and then the rest are discussion items. The first being recommendations from our Financial Advisory Committee, which has been working for the last about 14 or 15 months on our financial situation. I'll do a very quick update on the food service program, which I briefed you about in November. And then we'll have a discussion about the 21-22 revenue budget. All right, the first item on the agenda is approval of the 21-22 Bucks County Intermediate Unit budget. This is something that the school board is required to do every year, and it is to approve the contribution to the IU. The overall highlight of the IU budget is that there's no overall increase to the district contributions, but because the formula that is used to distribute the shares of contributions, Council Rock's share is down slightly. You can see in the table here, our contribution for the current year is $140,265, decreasing to $139,174. So about an $1,100 increase. These services are returned to us in the form of services that the IU provides. So these are contributions to their these respective divisions, which then the IU is able to then develop programs which it can return to the districts free of charge. So this is not for any administrative overhead or things like that. This is direct contributions for services that we can receive in return. So there's really, this is just pretty much a perfunctory approval, and I will ask if there's any questions on this particular item.
I think we're good. Thank you, Bill.
All right, no problem. I see that Mr. Oborowski is still connecting to the audio, so I'm going to skip ahead to the food service program update so that we can make sure he gets that worked out. So bear with me while I just kind of speed through here a little bit. When
Bill, can I interrupt? So,
of course.
Matt did The gentleman from the Financial Advisor Committee, does he also have a call-in option? Maybe you're already talking to him about this, about how to get him in, but maybe the computer audio isn't the best way and there are call-in numbers.
Yeah, he would have received the same panelist type invite that the rest of us got, which does have dial-in numbers. If he is dialed in, just tell me what his phone number is. If he's dialed into the regular number, and then I can move him over to a panelist position. Because I do see that there is one person who is attending who is dialed in with his phone. And if that's him, I can certainly add him over. So, but other than that, no, he got the same link with the phone number. He could use that to dial in with a phone if he chooses.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay. Matt, I will send you that quickly here, if I can do that. Okay. All right, so I want to inform the committee about an improving financial situation with respect to the food service program. You may recall when we were looking at the original forecast for the food service program back in November, we were projecting a potential loss for the entire year of just shy of $900,000. And I'm pleased to report that as a result of two particular factors, our potential updated forecast now with actuals for the first half of the year and projections for the second half of the year is now a loss of only about $25,000. So we've made some very good improvement in the program. And I appreciate all the hard work that Chartwell's has done to make that happen. The first factor contributing to that increase is that our participation has gone up. And that's likely due to two reasons. One is, as you all know, the district has done a big push to make sure that the community is aware of the benefit available to them, where free lunches are available whether children are attending in school or attending virtually. But we also, as the board well knows, transitioned into more days in school, and more days in school gets us more meals and easier to serve children. So those instructional model changes that happened in January for our elementary students allowed participation to increase by 26%. We obviously are anticipating further increases with the secondary students back in school, even though they are not having their meals in the traditional cafeteria setting. The second contributing factor is a new federal waiver that allows the district to use what's called the Summer Food Service Program. And the Summer Food Service Program has different requirements and different stipulations of the district, but the primary financial benefit is, instead of receiving $3.61 per meal for lunches reimbursement from the federal government, we are now able to receive $4.25 per meal per lunch. And that program the district is eligible for starting as of February 1st. So we completed all the application process for that. We are also able, under this program, to serve breakfast and receive a reimbursement of $2.42 per breakfast. The secondary school model, where we have the students come in and we provide them what we're calling a snack at the beginning of the day when they get off the bus, is counted as a breakfast. We're providing them a meal that qualifies under the federal requirements as a breakfast. So we're able to get that as a reimbursement. And then obviously they're receiving on the way out the door, they're receiving a lunch. And our Wednesday pickups are still happening as we've been doing since the pandemic started last spring. The Summer Food Service Program, or SFSP, also allows for weekend meals. So you will have noticed a change from serving 5 meals to 7 meals. But with additional reimbursement comes additional focus on the meal counting integrity and program integrity. So there was communication that went out to parents where we just need to make sure that we're doing a very thorough job of not double counting students. So for example, if a student is receiving a lunch in school, then they should not be coming to the Wednesday pickup and receiving meals at that time. They're only entitled to 1 meal per day. So we've modified some procedures, asking a couple other questions of families at the pickups to make sure that we're avoiding that situation. So I'm happy that this is turned around. I'm very pleased with Chartwell's and the work that they've done to help get us moving in a better direction. And at this point, $25,000 loss is more similar to what we typically see, and I would not anticipate that the general fund would need to substantially fund this program for this year. So it's a positive step. Are there any questions? Mr. Salomon. Well, Mr. Bialik, I'll let you, as chair, call on folks.
Bill, you run with it. It's fine. It's less interrupting when you just.
Very good. Mr. Salomon.
So just for clarity, Bill, the potential loss, what are you basing that on? Is that based on where we've been? And if nothing was to change, that's where we're headed, correct?
It's a combination of actuals through December 31st and then projections for the months of January onward. So it does assume the transition into 5-day-a-week instruction at the secondary level and continuing 4-day-a-week at the elementary level based on the current circumstances.
That's a heck of a turnaround. It's good to see those numbers. Thank you.
Bill. Quick question. Did I see earlier versions of this where we actually had a positive number in the potentials?
We did, and yes, and I corrected an error on the spreadsheet where that was the profit for the last 6 months of the year, and it needed to be added to the loss from the first half of the year. So that was my error, which I corrected, and it's a good catch by you. Forgive me for the confusion.
No, that's okay. So I'm just wondering, I guess if we can increase participation, we could see even bigger benefit because that's a huge swing of $900,000.
Yes, indeed.
So continue those efforts. That's great. Just want to say thank you for that. And that's it. That's all I got.
Bill, I'll ask. I'm assuming that when we return the elementary kids back to 5 days, that will close this gap even more, or potentially be positive for this period. Does that make sense, or is that too much of a gap to close?
I think that we've closed. There's less of an opportunity to. It's a smaller increment, just because we did make up a lot of the gap because we made such a dramatic change from no days in school to 5 days in school, or from hybrid to and then from hybrid to 5 days in school. So the increment will be a little smaller, but yes, there is potential for this to go even better with another day of elementary service and better participation at all levels.
Yeah, I'm assuming, well, 25,000 is relatively small in the scheme of things, so that just might be enough to at least bring us back to break even. So that'd be very good. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? I don't hear any others, so I'll do a quick check with Mr. Oborowski to see how his sound is doing. Dave, can you check in, see if we've got you on audio?
Looks like he's connected via phone and its phone is on mute.
Yes, I see that.
Yep. Can you hear me now?
We have you, Dave. Great.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, I could hear you guys all clear, so I'm not sure, but I just hung up and dialed in again. So I do apologize for the hold up there.
No problem. So I'll just introduce again Dave Oborowski, who's the chair of the Financial Advisory Committee. He's been with the committee a couple of times before to present, but this presentation is recommendations that the committee has come up with after their many months of work. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Oborowski to review the slides, and just let me know when you need me to move along, Dave.
All right, thank you. Yep, Bill, could you move to the next slide? So, here are our recommendations, broken down by what we'll term as immediate versus some long-term. So the first area is on healthcare in the stop loss premium marketing and review. So as we look at that, the big cost for the insurance, for the healthcare is that stop loss. So what we wanted to see is the district getting, the best and from multiple carriers to get that best rate for that stop loss insurance. Another recommendation is to possibly seek to combine some of the smaller lines of coverage, long-term disability, short-term, maybe dental and vision, and potentially rolling that all up with the stop loss provider. And then to evaluate other healthcare benefit consultants. Even if it's a meeting with 2 or 3 others, there's a way to gather some other additional information, different ways they look at the benefits, some options there. And it keeps the current consultant on their toes to make sure they're providing the best service possible. And the last point is better analytics and options for potential cost savings. What we see, we compared last year's and went through that from the subject matter experts, saw the presentation for this year, and we could see the same type of scenario and numbers used there, percentages of potential annual trend for growth and period weightings. They were the same as last year. So is a district getting, multiple scenarios to look at all of the scenarios to evaluate where can we find some cost savings? What are our options? Is the stop loss, cap, what happens if that's $100,000 higher? What if it's $100,000 lower? What's that do to that premium? And also, what's that do for the long-term cost? So any questions on the healthcare recommendations? All right, the other area is on the debt. So, the committee looked and really wanted to dig deeper into the cost impact and cost analysis of the capitalized interest. So, what is that long-term cost? We know there is the debt, and we know there's projects that need to be done, but what is that long-term cost of that capitalized interest? The next point is to build and maintain fund balance and cash. We know that's a key component from the rating agencies. Stronger fund balance leads to lower rates on the debt, so that's important. And then reviewing refinancing opportunities. We know that is tied to the callable dates of the debt, but making sure that is every opportunity taken advantage of, especially in this low rate environment. And then building and continue to build relationships with rating agencies, maybe looking at different rating agencies and working relationships there. So any questions on the debt area? Okay, Bill, next slide, please. So in the area of investments, is to review and update the current investment policy focused on 2 areas, level of acceptable risk and the time horizon. So we see those as 2 important things that need to be reviewed in the policy. And then a review of the cash flow analysis for possible excess cash investment opportunities. Take what we see as the committee, we see that there is usually let's say a $20 million cash balance that's there. A 3-year ladder of investments for that. Even if you did, just to try to gain more yield on that. So again, tying into the level of risk that the district has and the board has, and also that time horizon. And then really reviewing the investment performance expectations. Are the consultants of PFM, all the companies, are they pushed to get the best yield for the district? So we think that's an important part to look at. So any questions on the investments? Right, on the area of budgeting, really we recommend an improved department level of accountability. On the budget, there's the needs and the wants. So it's that budget. Hey, here's the specific needs that are needed, and hey, here's the wants that we know can get pulled out of that budget if needed. We saw that last year in the April timeframe when we took a look at some of the detailed department budget, looking for savings when the COVID pandemic really started to impact the district. So it's a little counterintuitive of cost savings, but utilize internal auditing for continuous review, potentially even the committee like the Financial Advisory Committee to continue to review the financials to just make recommendations, on the revenue and expense side. And then to consider the use of the pooled contingency model, the committee really, each month, we have Bill review that scorecard, and we really like the part where he's tracking, on the COVID end of here's that, the funds for the COVID and the cost of that. So we see that potentially being used in a greater sense for the budget process. So any questions on the budgeting side? All right, Bill, next slide, please. All right, some of the longer term recommendations, policy update, implementation, fund balance, as I mentioned earlier, important part, obviously for the rates, budgetary reserve and debt management. So we do think that these policies are important for the district. We also, would recommend our opinion was, more often review of policies. In the area of grants, looking at outsourcing the grant process, but also making sure that, the district is receiving as much of that grant as possible. Obviously, any cost involved in obtaining that grant is at the lowest cost possible. That grant is the biggest, piece that the district is receiving. And again, looking at all available grant administrators and again, pushing the current one, by looking at other ones. It does keep them on their toes. Any questions on the grants? In the area of mandates, obviously, we know the pension cost and the impact to the district's budget, but just, we would recommend that, as a board resolution, working with legislators, just to see if anything can be done to help the district on the pension costs. Next slide, Bill. Kind of the last longer term revenue sources, taking a look at naming rights, sponsorships, potentials, and then, looking also at community rentals. Is there, school facilities that could be safely, rented out to the community to generate some revenue? And the last area on collective bargaining, we know that the collective bargaining will be looked at next year. So really to prepare some detailed cost analysis, various scenarios to help in meeting and working through the collective bargaining process. So the committee is, this is the order that we've ranked the list, so that we're now planning to just go back and start to dig deeper into each of these areas. So, any questions? Okay. Yep.
I have a comment.
Mr. Adaki?
If I could. Sure, yeah. I just want to thank you, David, and the rest of the committee for spending countless hours researching and learning about the school district. And
Yes.
I really appreciate the recommendations. I think we can run with a lot of these if there's enough. I'm sure there's going to be enough support. That it's just nice to have a third party come in and offer these ideas and to present them publicly. I think is great stuff as members of the community giving back. So I just want to say I appreciate all the points you brought up tonight, and I think it's very useful and it's going to be helpful moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I think Andy Black had his hand raised next.
Thanks, Mark. David, appreciate the presentation tonight.
Yep.
I know it's not easy just to jump into a school board meeting and give your first presentation. So well done. More importantly, thank you to you and to the entire group for the work. There's a lot of detail that's in there, and this was a really good top line summary of some of the key areas of importance for us. And for me, it was a real validator of the work and the focus areas that we've had. And it also validates the strength of our team in place and the approach and process that we've had through the years, and most recently under the leadership of Mr. Stone and Dr. Frazier. So, great stuff there. Some of these areas for me have been things that we've known about that we haven't had the capacity to get to. I would be really interested as you guys dig deeper into how we can raise more revenue, in particular, naming rights, sponsorships. I think we've had that conversations many times and just not been able to get to it. So, now that we've got another group, maybe there's something in there. I defer to Mr. Stone and you guys as a group. Also, I think grant opportunities, especially with the the governor's new budget and the ability to open up RCAP grant dollars for schools is a place that there might be some opportunities. Although Ms. O'Grady's been great and very successful in that grant writing piece. So, you know, I guess I'd have one question for you, and maybe it's not the time. Maybe you do need to go a bit deeper in each topic. But, you know, in summary, was there any significant insights that you had? Any big areas to prioritize for us? Either something that we're not doing, or an area that we need to course correct in the near term as you went through with a fresh set of eyes?
I would say really pushing all of the consultants that you have, that you are receiving, you know, multiple scenarios and they're digging into it. You know, the committee sees, like I mentioned on the healthcare end, you know, kind of what I'll say is the same scenario, the same presentation each year. It's just the numbers have changed from this year to, you know, the next year and next year. You know, so are there multiple scenarios being looked at? So, you know, really to evaluate, you know, let's say the healthcare, you know, on that stop loss is, you know, there should be, you know, 6, 7 scenarios to look at, you know, to dig in there. But when we saw the presentation, again, it seemed to us it's the same presentation. So it was something across the board that we saw that's, you know, one area that, you know, we're working with Bill to really dig into, get more and ask more questions back to the consultants on that.
Excellent. All right. Well, hey, I appreciate the overview and looking forward to some recommended actions against some of the areas you're going to be looking into. Appreciate it, David.
All right. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Tate has his hand raised. Mr. Tate.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Bialik. Thanks, Mr. Oborowski. I appreciate the work that you and the group has done and working with Bill Stone on this. A lot of good stuff here. Andy touched on the grant application process, and Susan O'Grady really has done a marvelous job. And of course, she's stretched thin with the communications responsibilities as well. So I really like your idea of looking for outside resources. And I had one question that had to do, I'm intrigued by the point you had in there about pooled contingencies. Could you explain that a little bit more? I think that's interesting.
Yeah, you know, it was a topic that Bill had brought up to the committee, and we, you know, really it's just more taking that, you know, I guess I'll use that COVID, knowing that there's, you know, going to be contingency, things that come up during the year that are unplanned. So is there, you know, a method is just to put a pool of funds for those type of events that occur that is managed for specifically those specific events. So you have your, you know, operating budget and you have your typical reoccurring, you know, annual expenses that you go through, but then there's this pool of funds that are used for those things that, you know, a COVID event again, you know, hopefully never happens again or another 100 years from now, but something like that, that then the funds are in one place that everyone knows to go to that pooled source to pull those funds, and they're included in the budget, but in one big lump sum, not really per se assigned specifically to anything. So, you know, it was a concept that I liked from a budgeting end and all the years of budgeting that I've done, and it's something that I've looked at and said, you know, this could work. So it's something we're going to dig a little bit deeper with.
Marvelous, great. Thanks very much.
Yep.
Good. Anyone else? Questions? Comments? Well, I'll just, I want to say, Mr. Stone, the entire Financial Advisory Committee, and Mr. Oborowski, of course, thank you for your time. This is really great information. I particularly like the fact that you broke it down into immediate and long-term items. I've got a lot of notes in front of me about thoughts about that. I really like the idea of the scorecard, continuing that scorecard. The pooled contingency is something that Bill and I have talked about before. And of course, we always want to press our consultants as much as we rely on them, and they really become integral with the district. whether they be healthcare, financial, our solicitor, we always have to make sure we're getting the best out of them. And I've been an advocate for these RFPs and just challenging them for a long time. Even if we keep the people that we have, it's not about always replacing the people. It's making sure we get the best out of them. Those are all really great points, David. I would say that it's just as from a going forward point of view, it might make sense to you've got 4 immediate items. Maybe we started having a discussion with Mr. Stone and the group about focusing on 2 that'll be most impactful, and see what we can do with those 2 items. And maybe 2's too many. Maybe we do 1 at a time. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about how best to move forward, and we could treat this like a punch list that we come back to and address these items as we go.
When we put this together, that healthcare and debt, we see as the top 2. So these would be 2 that we would want to focus on. We've already, begun to circle back on the healthcare. So we've, again, requested from Bill some additional information. And, just earlier this week, we spent a little time talking about the debt. So those would be 2 areas that, I would recommend we just continue to work on.
Well, that's great, and it is again really nice to have this group of individuals laser focused on these items that we can potentially later take action on. So, do you need, Bill or Dr. Frazier? Do you need any other direction from us as a board to allow the Financial Advisory Committee to focus on these 2 items?
I think that the appropriate path forward would be for the board to consider accepting the committee's recommendations at an action meeting, which of course doesn't bind us to do anything, but in that action you could direct me and the Financial Advisory Committee to focus on some, all, or specific recommendations that are included in the report that would have an immediate impact. And then we can just continue to have these conversations at Finance Committee about checking in on progress and then continuing to work through this list. There are some items on this list when I look at it that will take some time to implement, but they would be foundational for some longer term savings. For example, the investment policy changes. If we made those changes in the next several months, those investment returns would not be seen until the following fiscal year. But nevertheless, if we don't lay that groundwork first, then we won't be able to reap those benefits later on. So I'd like to have the opportunity to look at some of those where they may not have that immediate impact, but need to be in place so that we can take advantage in the future.
Yeah, I think Mr. Solomon has a question before we go to Mr. Solomon, I'll just weigh in a bit. I really like the idea of the cash flow analysis as it relates to the investments and really that asset liability matching. So that may be something that perhaps wouldn't take too much of the committee's time. Maybe we can put that on cornerstones. And I guess, Bill, your office would have to be heavily involved in that as well. So I guess you'd have to prioritize that, but just thinking out loud. Mr. Solomon.
Thank you, Mr. Bialik. And just a quick comment, as much as I love in-person meetings, for the folks that have been calling in or have to call in for whatever reason, sometimes they can't hear as well. This is, I don't consider any meeting non-important, but it's nice having everybody's attention, seeing the displays, having this conversation, because I think some things get lost on the phone. So that's just my 2 cents on that. David, great work. When I first saw the slides, nothing really jumped out at me. These are some of the things that I've been thinking about in terms, probably not as deep as you guys did. In a couple of weeks, we as a board have to take a look at a major capital plan involving renovating multiple schools and possibly adding a turf project to this Council Rock South area. Did you guys take a look at our capital program? And I'm sure you did with the debt costs. And can you give me some thoughts, knowing that these projects or not knowing these projects are coming up, what the committee was thinking?
Sure. our focus obviously was really, on cost saving. So, really our focus was on that cost of debt, and so that's where, first and foremost for us, just the, that capitalized interest just kind of, piqued us from what is that true impact and, on that end. So we understand the importance of the projects. And it's just really, for us, we look at it as finding the balance of trying to, again, reduce that cost of debt, as low as possible, but also to be able to accomplish all of the projects that need to be done. So again, it's an area that we went through with the subject matter expert on a good, 2-hour presentation, and we've got a lot of data to look at. And again, it's an area that we're just going to really roll our sleeves up and dig a little bit deeper into those numbers and make sure that we've got a full understanding of the, for instance, the capitalized interest.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dave.
Yep.
I don't see any other questions, but I'm just wondering, we don't have, we only have a few members of the public, but that capitalized interest is it is a balancing issue, and it is a confusing issue, because then of course, if we don't take advantage of the full amount of capitalized interest that we can, we have increased costs of construction, which are not insignificant, especially today.
Right.
So I guess we've talked about that quite a bit, and maybe we don't need an explanation unless somebody feels that we do. No? Okay.
Mark, you muted yourself.
Oh, I did. I don't see any comments or questions. Sorry. Mr. Stone, are you ready to move on?
Yes, I am. I'll publicly thank Dave and the Financial Advisory Committee for their commitment. They meet twice a month, once with me to do some education, and once as a group to work on these recommendations. And they are early birds, 7:30 a.m. I've appreciated getting to know some members of the community, and they are very committed to this district. So Dave, please express my thanks to the group.
I will. Thank you.
Yeah, please from everyone on the board and the administration, David, make sure everyone knows how much we appreciate this.
Absolutely.
I will. Thank you.
Certainly a real value to the district. And Mr. Bollock, I don't want to let this opportunity go by without thanking you as well. This was in very large part your brainchild, and you originally had this idea a number of years ago. And finally, we got to the point of being able to operationalize it, and we're reaping some good rewards out of it. So want to make sure that you get that due credit here as well.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I'll move on then. We'll get to our last topic of the evening, which is a update on our 2021-22 budget development process. And we're starting tonight with taking a look at the revenue budget. And we'll do a couple of things tonight. First of all, we're going to look at what's included in revenue. Just do that general overview of what comprises the money that comes into the school district, compare it to prior years and current budgets. We'll also start discussing the controllable variables within the revenue budget and what we can affect as a district in order to change those figures that you see up on the screen there. And we'll also talk about a potential strategy that we could use as we begin to look at dealing with the budget deficit on our books at about $10.5 million. And we'll talk about the way that we might be able to do that. So just to set the stage for what we'll be discussing, this is our standard table of the revenue budget, showing going from right to left here, my right to left, the last 2 years of actual spending, the current year's budget, the year we're living in, and then the preliminary budget for the next budget year, so the year that we'll be moving into. And it shows obviously the revenue by sources. So we have a total preliminary budget of $249.4 million. And that is primarily locally funded. As you can see, $192.6 million of that 249.4 coming from local sources, which, as we've talked about many times, that's the common way that school districts in this particular area are funded for the most part. Just very quickly, if we harken back to this table here, I'm going to do just a quick check on the differences between what's proposed in this preliminary budget and what's in our current budget. Obviously, the largest one is that 3% real estate tax increase. That's the biggest line item in that budget overall. We're also seeing some changes in what I call our major local revenue accounts. Now, you'll recall that our 2021 budget, this current year's budget, was reduced fairly significantly in the local revenue line items because at the time we were only about a month and a half into the pandemic when this budget had to be approved. So we had a lot of real unknowns with respect to the long-term and the short-term and long-term impacts of the pandemic and how it would affect, in particular, tax collections. But so in these 3 sub-bullet points here, we're starting to see a little bit of the real impact of those. So the EIT and the earned income tax and the real estate transfer tax budgets were pretty significantly reduced in 2021. But as an example, as we're now 6 months into this fiscal year, this has been really, this particular economic downturn has been the polar opposite of the Great Recession of 08-09 with respect to real estate taxes or real estate transfer taxes, because at that time, the real estate market really went down and housing prices went down and sales went down. The opposite is happening now. We're seeing tremendous collections in real estate transfer taxes. Just anecdotally, anybody who's following the local real estate market sees that houses are not on the market for a long time. They're going for over asking price. And so we are seeing some more significant collections of transfer tax than we would normally. EIT similarly was reduced fairly substantially. It has not bounced back to the level it was prior to the pandemic, but a lot of the wage losses were at the very lowest end of the spectrum of wages. Mostly the lowest wage earners have been most impacted by the pandemic, and so our revenue is up budget to budget, but not as high as it was prior to March of 2020. And in another slide, you'll be able to see that impact.
Hey, Bill, quick
Yes.
question for you here. Is it safe to assume that given what's happening in the real estate market, and I'm seeing it firsthand out here as I look, we're seeing a lot of influx from New York and New Jersey coming in, and a lot of folks whose kids are going off to college or selling their homes. While the lower end of the spectrum has dropped off due to the recession, is it feasible to think we're going to see some growth in EIT being driven by the top end, which will be more significant than what's fallen off, just based on what's coming in with the housing now?
Yeah, so it's possible. I think what we're seeing is in the first half of the year, we saw the shift out of the prior year into the current year because of the change in the filing deadline. So we saw a big spike in August because they pushed the filing deadline back, and now I think we're seeing a little bit more stability in that line item because in general our community is in a white, it's a white collar community, and we're not seeing as much of an impact on that line item. I don't know if I can say with any certainty growth or stable or loss at this point, because that analysis is a little bit more economic than it is anecdotal. But just from seeing 6 months of collections, we're ahead of a reduced budget, which is good. We brought the budget down appropriately, and so we're not in. I don't feel like we're in the position of missing our revenue target in that particular line item. I believe we're going to at least meet that target. So that's
yeah. Thanks. I'm no sage, but I think we're going to see an uptick in EIT based on the transition into the district. I think we're also going to see more kids coming in as folks with families migrate from areas that they're trying to get away from.
All right. So I'll comment quickly on delinquent taxes. This has been an area where the delinquent taxes have been declining over the last several years, and that's primarily a result of a stronger collections on the current real estate tax. So more folks paying on time, fewer folks are paying late. But again, we did the board did make the change to a new delinquent real estate tax collector, and I anticipate we could see some bumps in that area. But right now, with the preliminary data that we put together, following that trend would result in a decrease to that line item. Similarly, our other local revenue, so the very small percentage of that 192 million is in the area of facility rentals and tuition from other districts and the aquatics program. Those are obviously with the pandemic and our buildings not being fully open, we're seeing basically no revenue in those line items. And so when you total those three line items up, it's about another $700,000 that's not coming in. And so again, kind of assuming worst case scenario on those line items, they've been more or less reduced pretty substantially. And so it's something we'll want to monitor as we move ahead. We will talk in detail about the governor's proposed budget, but at the time the preliminary budget was put together, the state's economic situation is pretty dire as far as their collections. They're seeing similar increases in transfer taxes and wages as the district, but they are more dependent on sales tax, hotel taxes, things like that. So, and they have some more structural budget issues that have to be dealt with. So at the time the preliminary budget was put together a few months ago, I did budget for a -2% in state subsidies. There's offsetting increases in FICA and PSERS reimbursements. Again, remember 50% of those payments we make for Social Security and for retirement do get reimbursed by the state. So that that $2.3 million is the net of the increases on the expense side. And then the last item, budget to budget, is the prior year budget included $1.1 million of federal CARES Act money that had been allocated. And again, at the time the preliminary budget was put together, we had no knowledge of any further CARES money that was coming. So that line item had to be zeroed out. So again, at the end of the presentation, when we get to federal, we'll talk about what we might be able to do with the money that's recently been announced for the district right before the new year, as well as the fact that there are some other proposals that might include some additional funds. So we start with the revenue budget in the budget development process because it's the amount of money that we have to spend as an organization. It's the same as what we all do in our personal budgets. You start with what money is going to come in to determine what you can afford to do. So it's the most critical aspect of budget preparation. And the purpose of this discussion is to bring to light is to bring some transparency into how the revenue budget is developed. Historically, Council Rock has been using a $4 million budget deficit model, which was closed at the end of the year by plus 1% on the revenue side, meaning that revenue exceeded budget by about 1% and expenditures were less than budget by about 1% to make up that $4 million difference. So what we're going to go through in the next couple of slides is to show how that 1% kind of comes together in reality when we put a revenue budget together. And we can use these assumptions that are on the next couple of slides as a potential tool that we can evaluate as we look at the overall budget process if we want to make adjustments. So in keeping with that transparency about what, kind of how the revenue budget is put together, I'll also share what could happen if we were to move ahead with making some of these adjustments, because making these adjustments and changing these assumptions does have the potential to offset some of that budget deficit that we looked at last month. that $10.3 million. And we'll go through how that happens. So again, we're going to be looking in this section of the local budget. This is all local revenue right here. And these that I'm kind of circling with the cursor here, these are 99% of the total local revenue. And remember, this is 99% of 77% of our total revenue budget. So these are our most significant line items. This is the way we would move the needle on any changes. You can see all other local revenue, only $2.2 million in that budget. So this is how we can try to address some of these items. So the first, obviously largest revenue that we have is our current real estate tax, and that's built on 3 factors to get to that $163.8 million revenue budget line item. So the first one, I'll start at the bottom here, is the millage rate. And that's the only controllable factor at the board's disposal in this calculation. The board has full discretion up to the maximum allowed under Act 1, which is 3%. They have full discretion to go with a 3% real estate tax increase. So this is the maximum amount allowed by Act 1. Again, and we'll continue to monitor whether we can apply for any exceptions, and we'll do so if able. The second 2 factors are the assessed value, so the tax base, the value of property in Council Rock School District, and the collection rate. How many people pay the tax on time? Again, this is it's an accounting matter, but if you pay on time, it's called current real estate tax. If you pay late, it's delinquent. In order to calculate that $163.8 million, we have to make an assumption on the assessed value. And historically, that assessment has been no growth and no loss in assessed value. So basically flat assessment, no change in assessment. Similarly, we use 97.2% as a collection rate, assuming that 97 out of 100 taxpayers will pay their taxes on time. And that's also no change in the current preliminary budget that we put together. What's happening in the tables on the right here is taking a look at 10 years of historical data to determine what actually happens to these 2 factors in reality when we actually go through the collection process and reconcile at the end of the year. So starting with the assessed value of all property, we see on average over that 10-year span that assessment grows at about 0.2% year over year. And it happens within a range of negative 0.6% to positive 0.8%. So that means that in the worst year, the assessment actually decreased by 0.6%, which would mean in real dollars on this year's budget, the potential impact of having to reduce our budget by $1 million. The highest assessment growth in the best year was 0.8%, which again, in real dollars, if applied into the formula, would yield another $1.4 million if we were to use this factor in this instead of 0.0%, if we used 0.8%, $1.4 million. So similar exercise on the collection rate. The average collection rate, 97.4%, where it varied between a minus 0.1%, meaning it finished 0.1% below that budgeted collection rate, or even as high as 1% higher, which again leads to a potential dollar impact of negative $100,000 to the overall revenue, or plus 1.8 million. So if we were to use the average assumptions, right? So if we were to plug in 0.2% into the formula and 97.4% into the formula, it has the impact of increasing the real estate tax revenue by $1.5 million. Okay, but again, I point out that this is, this is an average over that 10-year period, and you can see that variance range. It could be higher, it could be lower. We undertake a similar exercise with other local revenue. Now it's a little bit different because there are fewer factors that within our control. These are taxes that we we don't control the amount of collections. We set the rate historically, and then there's very little that can be done within those numbers. And for example, interim real estate taxes, these are billed when there's a change in a property. Someone builds an addition or there's an assessment reduction. That's where an interim real estate tax comes into play. But what happens in this exercise is we take what's in the current budget, 21-22 for the preliminary budget assumption, and for interim real estate taxes, that's $705,000 approximately. And we compare that to that average collections over that same period, that same 10-year period, to generate a historical average. So on average, the amount collected every year was $823,000, but within a range of $500,000 approximately to $1.2 million. So you could see that if we then compare this 705 to the historical average of 823, the difference to reach that average is $118,000. So if we have an average year, we could increase the preliminary budget assumption by $118,000. But know that that falls within a range of minus $100,000 to plus $500,000. And then the exercise continues down the line. So earned income tax, we have a budget assumption of $16.8 million, just about. The historical average is about 16.9, but within a range of 15.1 to 18.4 million. So the difference to reach that average is 108,000. Falls and giving you a range of potential impacts to the budget, the revenue budget of minus 1.7 to plus 1.6. So it just continues on, and I'll note here, rather than go through each and every one, I'll note here this one in red, which shows that the assumption in the 21-22 budget is $2.9 million for real estate transfer taxes, based on what we're seeing in the current market, and that's slightly above what the historical average was. So just to be faithful to the analysis, this number is just a very small reduction of minus $27,000 within that range. So if I go back quickly to this slide and just remind you of using that average assumption of plus 1.5 million and these figures here, when those are all totaled up, these local revenue changes could be adjusted by $2.4 million, which is that 1% that we've historically seen as a surplus. So there's time to review these assumptions before the preliminary or the final budget is adopted, and take a look at more data to see how the actual collections are coming in, because averages are not indicative of the future at all times. But this approach to looking at these assumptions and using something that's closer to what happens on average rather than what's been done just for years and years, it's less tangible, but it also avoids some of the reductions in expenses in the classroom, which again, that's the objective that we want to try to achieve. Is if we have a deficit to close, we try to do so as far away from students and teachers as possible. So again, I'll just restate, if we were to use average assumptions, what we've seen historically, and plug those into our revenue calculations, you see these pluses here, we add all those up, and that totals up to $2.4 million, which could go to offsetting that $10.3 million budget deficit that I presented last month and that the board approved in a preliminary budget. I'll pause briefly there to take any questions, because that was a lot of information. Mr. Salmon.
Yeah, it's more, Bill, thanks. It's more of a question for Dr. Frazier. I know it's not a huge chunk of money, but are we considering where's your head with opening the gyms, opening the pool for rentals for outside users to rent our facilities?
Yeah, we've talked about doing so, Mr. Solomon, starting in the summer. So standing pat, through the spring season here. In fact, a lot of that already would have been awarded at this point. But really taking a look at opening things back up in the summertime.
Okay, thanks.
I don't see any other hands up, Bill.
I'll move on then. Presumably, the board has heard this, at least a summary of Governor Wolf's state budget proposal, which he presented last week. His proposal was very bold. There were significant increases in subsidies for K-12 ed. There were savings potentially for the school district in charter school funding reform. Mr. Block mentioned the opening of the RCAP program to school districts. He proposed a minimum wage increase, which could impact our third-party contracts. But I snipped a headline, which is, as you look kind of across the state newspapers, the proposal has been called, dead on arrival, and that it's that there's no chance that it's going to happen, and that's because it's primarily funded by a change in the state income tax structure. And for a lot of folks, it would be a tax increase. For some folks, it would be tax decreases. So the guidance that's coming out on the state budget proposal is not to incorporate the proposal as Governor Wolf set it forth, but rather to be more conservative on the proposal until more information comes out on the details within that budget. But you'll recall that the 21-22 preliminary budget was built with that minus 2% assumption based on the state's economic factors. So the Governor Wolf's budget was very optimistic on state revenue growth. And so I've done a similar exercise to what you saw on the previous slides with respect to the state basic ed and special ed subsidies. Again, these are the largest state subsidies that we receive. If we were to simply get the same amount of money that we're getting this year, you see that the budget assumption is 14.45. We're currently getting about 14.8. That's an additional $341,000 if we were to get the same amount of money as we did last year. Similarly, on special education, because I assumed minus 2%, we would stand to get another $109,000 if our our subsidy was simply held flat. On the basic ed subsidy, again, I'll point out that there's been a push in recent years in order to address some of the equity issues that the state sees in state funding, would be to run all funds through the new basic education funding formula, which was passed in 2015-16. Council Rock would lose significant funds if that were to happen. Our funds would, the monies that we've been receiving over the years, the $14.8 million, would essentially be redistributed to other school districts across the state, and we would stand to lose $5.4 million if all monies were simply to flow through that basic education formula. Governor Wolf, in his proposal, put in extra money to essentially hold all districts harmless so that there would be no revenue loss. But that's still, I just want to point that out as if the state were to simply just put all the money through the funding formula, that could be very significant for Council Rock. The governor's proposal, in addition to running the money through the funding formula, holding everyone harmless, also added $200 million to the proposal. So if you go all the way from this 14.45 to basically the maximum amount of money that Council Rock could get if the governor's proposal goes all the way through, that could be another $641,000. Governor Wolf also proposed $200 million to the special education subsidy line item statewide, which would translate into about $357,000 in additional funds compared to where the budget is currently at. So we need to let the Harrisburg politics guide us in this decision. There's really very little known at this point about where this is actually going to land because of the very disparate views of the proposal from the governor, what the governor's put forth, and what the legislature has said about the proposal. So I just wanted to show you what the options are, from worst case scenario of -2 to best case scenario of getting another $200 million statewide. So between that last slide there and the local revenue slide, where you saw all the pluses and the minuses, the words of caution about this approach, where you're seeing the conservatism that's built into the budget, that 1%. So this approach works when you're budgeting with a zero deficit, and when you take that inherent conservatism out, you're reducing the likelihood of a revenue surplus and possibly eliminating it altogether, because you just don't have that that built-in cushion. So if we were to make these adjustments on the revenue side of the budget, we would want to do so with a commitment from the board that we would achieve a zero deficit budget, meaning we would no longer have that imbalance between revenue and expenditures when the final budget is approved. So just words of caution with that, because if you increase your revenue, it makes it much harder. If you keep that deficit in there, if revenues don't hit their targets, that deficit very quickly grows to something that's really difficult to catch up to. So these revenue adjustments are not a catch-all that's going to totally eliminate that budget deficit. There's still a lot of work that will have to be done on the expenditure side, but this is a tool in our toolbox that we can use for trying to achieve an overall budget that best meets the needs of our students. And then quickly, the last slide here, the board is aware that we received a second round of what's known as the CARES Act ESSER funds. It's about $1.1 million, and we actually have a lot of time to make some decisions about what to do with these funds. Unlike the first round of funding, which the application was due very quickly and had sort of a limited scope of what you could spend it on, this application is not due until the end of the calendar year, and the funds don't need to be spent until the last date of spending is September 1st of 2023. So that actually spans over the next 2+ budget years. So we can take a look at trying to use those funds over a long period of time to be able to stretch that out and that best avoid a potential fiscal cliff like we saw back in the last round of stimulus funds, where if they all get stuffed into one budget, then they have to be replaced in the subsequent budget. So this is, we as an organization have work to do to try to find the best way to utilize these funds. And then there's still talk with a new presidential administration and a new federal legislature about some proposed economic relief packages. President Biden's number was $1.9 billion and included some money for K-12 schools. I believe the counter proposal from the Senate was about $600 billion and didn't include, Biden was 1.9 trillion. The legislature was 600 billion. But I don't believe that there was any direct relief for schools in that package. So we'll just need to obviously continue to monitor that and see if there's any more funds that can be used. So that is all I have on the revenue budget, and happy to take questions or comments. Thank you.
I have a question. Thank you, Mr. Bialik. Mr. Stone, looking at that basic education funding formula, that's not something that's not passed and signed by the governor, right?
No.
Right. I don't think so. Do you think that that's actually going to be signed by the governor? Is that why you're putting it in here?
The governor in his last two budget addresses has indicated his desire to run all the money through the basic ed funding formula, but he did in this budget recognize that there would be districts that would be harmed by doing so. So he did put that adjustment in, but it's a significant amount of money in order to keep Council Rock whole and all the other districts who were kind of on the other end of the redistribution whole. So it's just going to be a very difficult lift and can't be done with the current revenues that the state has at its disposal. But so I don't think that this proposal that he put forth is likely, but did just want to kind of show the components of what's out there in case that something is, just a piece of the package goes forward.
Right, and even if he did do it, this would only be that a $200 million assumption would just be for the 1 year, but because we're an affluent school district, we're looking at a $5 million reduction plus going forward. That's substantial. I would hope that wouldn't be the case. We got to do whatever we can lobbying from what the advisory committee had said to try to call up. So maybe we can organize something. But thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Mr. Block has his hand up.
Thanks, Mr. Bialik. Mr. Hidalgo just caught at the tail end of his comment. This had come up several years ago, and we spent some time with Scott Petrie trying to understand what influence we could have or what points we could push. I would imagine all of our P organizations are all over this, but at some point, if it makes sense to work with Wendy, Perry, and Steve, to kind of get this on the radar screen if we think it's real, it could be devastating. And I know there's a lot of push in the legislature, and typically the legislature gets run by the folks who are in the middle, meaning geographically, and that's where they want to pull the money, and it typically comes from us. So if there's anything we can do with them or that you need from us, from an advocacy perspective, to Mr. Hidalgo's point, please let us know.
Thank you. Will do.
I'll comment since I don't see any other hands. A couple things. So Bill, what I heard you say is you're looking for direction from us about the zero budget deficit structure. I prefer this structure myself. I've always been uncomfortable with that, running a deficit in our budget and hoping that we're going to close that gap. So you're looking for us tonight to give you some direction on that. Is that right? How we
Not
feel?
necessarily, I'm just pointing out that this is a tool that at our disposal. But as we move forward in the budget process, we are going to have to, before the proposed final budget make a change to that budget deficit and work toward reducing it. So if there's a majority of the board that would want to see a budget that has these adjusted assumptions in it, I can begin to do that work and make those changes.
Yeah, and if I could just piggyback off that real quickly. So as Mr. Stone said previously, we've historically operated 4 million, 4.5 million to the bad. This past year, we got that down, Bill, to 3 million or just under 3 million. So we made, a good step, but only a step in that direction. And we're not under any any beliefs here that we're going to be able to get this to a zero deficit this year for the 21-22 budget, but we would certainly like to take another big step. And perhaps these revenue, pinching this together, some of these assumptions could be an aid in helping us take that step. And Bill and I certainly have the shared goal of getting to a zero deficit in the not too distant future. So we would like to see some movement, I think, in this direction. The question as we go through this budget process would be just how much.
Well, let me ask you, since you mentioned the deficit. So we have a $10.5 million deficit. And we're used to seeing these deficits, and then, they get closed in a couple different ways. You folks go back and say, let's see what we can do on our end. Well, Dr. Frazier, that's a big number, $2.5 million. So what can we do to close that gap?
You mean the 10.5?
Did I say 2.5? I was being optimistic, I guess. I 10.5. Yeah.
Yeah, I wish. We both wish. Yeah, so we it's as you said, it's the same process that we've used in the past. We had a cabinet meeting this morning, as is typical for Thursday mornings, and Bill started to lay the groundwork. Bill and I've met each of the past couple of days talking budget, and one of the financial advisory committee recommendations is really talking about the departmental budgets, and that's where our focus is right now. It's as we talk about the 300s to 900s, we're taking a look soup to nuts. Obviously, we've had to make some cuts in past years. Technology comes to top of mind, and we can't keep operating in some of those areas to the extent that we have been, which means that we just really need to be disciplined everywhere else. So the analysis that we're going through right now, and Bill has done the work for this, is not taking a look at budget to budget, but looking at actuals. So over the past X number of years, what's the actual spend? Similar to what he's showing here this evening on the revenue side. What's the minimum? What's the maximum for each department? And then what's the average over those years? And if you have any outliers, then, toss out those outliers and then match that up with the budget request for, in this case, the 21-22 school year. So that's the work that's going on right now. It's the work that typically goes on this time of year, and we tighten our belt buckles and sharpen our pencils and make some hard decisions. And as Bill always says, make those decisions as far away from the classroom as possible, knowing that you can't do 10.5 million completely away from the classroom. It's just not there. But we start away from the classroom, and those decisions get obviously more and more difficult the closer we get up to that 10.5 mark.
Yeah, it feels like we've been trimming the fat ever since I got on this board, and I can't imagine that there's any left. But yeah, it's a big number, 10.5. Okay. Very good. Dr. Thorpe.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I'll reiterate what you said, Mark. I am supportive of a zero deficit budget. And like you just said, you took my other comment with trimming the fat. I was going to say blood from a stone, but we're rapidly approaching a point where, this gets hard. And, I don't know, 10.5 is a big number, but frankly, anything not from zero is going to be a big number moving forward. So we have to get there, and I'm supportive of whatever it takes to stop deficit spending. Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? All right, Mr. Stone, what else do you have?
That's all, Mr. Braddock. That's the end of my presentation.
Okay, well done again. Thank you, everyone. And I am not seeing any other questions or comments. So with that, I believe we'll adjourn.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Night.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thanks all.
Good stuff.
Good night.